We're moving now. The band is, yeah, we're going to move the panel now. And if I can get the mics on.
Step fucking way.
Thank you, guys. Good morning, everyone. Is it on? I think so. Can you hear me? All right. Welcome to Speaking Science. Let's give another round of applause to Redbone for their amazing drumming this morning. I'm Christy Kramers, and I'm the Director of Graduate and Faculty Leadership Programs at the Institute on the Environment here at the University of Minnesota, and we're so excited to see all of you here today to learn how to better communicate your research and what matters most to you and to the world. And to get us started, just one reminder, we do have our hashtag. So if you're a tweeter or other social media user, this is our hashtag for the conference, SpeakSci19. And to continue this theme of honoring this place that we live in, Minnesota, we have Neil McKay, who is going to be doing a land recognition and blessing for us this morning. Neil has been teaching here at the University of Minnesota, teaching the Dakota language for 20 years. So let's please give a warm welcome to Neil.
Hametakepe. O mai kachne gapi ki hanape yuhatapo. Oh. Ampetu kinde oasana chante washtena pe chuzapido. Dakodia chante maza kaish machpia chanduhupa makiapi. Pero wakantua oyate hechia tawa higa mini wakan oyanke hechia omawapido. Atewe Dakota naku inawa e khato hecha khink pa hecha oapi. Na kompetu kinde wia wanji chandi maku hacha chik aida taku donana epictido. Heo ampetu kinde yokpia wahido no taku donana uchichapte. Dakota ekta o yukchanaku trawachi unki traupi he hochid he no studiaptido. So I said, hello, my relatives. I had asked if you understand me to raise your hand, but nobody raised their hand. On this day, I greet each and every one of you with a good heart and a handshake. I am Chante Maza, or Machpia Chanduhupa. My English name is Neil McKay. I am Bidawakantuan Dakota. That is my family group, my Tioshpai. We do not have clans. And I am enrolled up at the Spirit Lake Nation. I am a citizen of the Spirit Lake Nation, Dakota. My dad is Dakota, my mom is Ojibwe. I was given tobacco to come here and say a few things, and I'm very happy to be here today. So I am an instructor on campus. I teach Dakota language and history here on campus. I produce new speakers and teachers of the language. That is my job. But usually I start off my talks and I ask people, whose land are you on? And the answer to that is you are on Dakota land. So the Dakota people are the only people in the world that can say that they are from this area. So we emerged from the Mendota area. We say Bedote. And it's important that you know that because in today's world, especially with the political climate, there are alternative facts and some silly things like that. But I'm here to tell you the truth about some things. And being on Dakota land, why do I say that? So typically the Euro-American citizen might say we're on US soil. Well, that would be true if the United States actually followed through with what they were supposed to do. So we signed a treaty with the United States government, on a few treaties. The US did not uphold its end of the bargain at all. So when you sign a treaty, and a treaty can only be signed by 2 or more sovereign nations, it's a formal agreement. If you do not uphold your end of the bargain, then things are supposed to go back to the way that they are. So you can back out of a treaty, but also if you don't uphold your bargain, your end of the bargain, things go back. So this is legally Dakota land, and we are still fighting for it, and we are still here. So something to be aware of. So this is a colonial institution, and it is illegally occupying Dakota land. So if you are not Dakota and you are here, you are actually illegally occupying this land. Notice I'm not calling you illegals, okay? Because in Dakota way, you are relatives. And this is something that we need to talk about and discuss and work out in a good way, because the university functions and operates on stolen land. And that is the majority of the academic institutions on what is now known as the United States. But if you talk to the local indigenous people of any area, they will say that this is our land. So something to think about. But just wanted to share with you, you know, in Dakota, we don't really have a word for science. We don't have a word for artists. We don't have a word for religion. Because these are things that kind of everybody does. It kind of permeates our whole existence. So scientific observation, experimentation, all these things. We view it a little bit differently. So I'll leave you with one example. Up until the early part of the 1900s, most U.S. medicine, 60% of U.S. medicine was based off of indigenous medicine. But how did we learn about medicine? Well, of course, lots of observation, probably trying out things that we shouldn't be trying out. But the bear has given us a lot of medicine. By observing the bear and what the bear uses for medicine, what the bear eats, we learned a lot of medicine from the bear. So watching our relatives, our fellow parts of creation, in essence. So we have a saying, we say, mitakuye owasi, usually when we finish a prayer, or we say addressing the great unknown. But what that's saying is, we're all part of the same creation. None of us is better or lesser than the other. We all have our parts in creation, and we're all related. So anyway, just wanted to leave that with you. And naku Dakota makoche ki ded naya hipido. Welcome to Dakota land. So hohechu tuktedo toksta ake wachianga piktedo. Dayan awai ichi dakapo. So take care. Have fun at the conference.
Thank you, Neil, so much for helping us to acknowledge and honor the original people of this land, and also I think we should give another round of applause if you had the pleasure of listening to the Redbone singers and drumming. They were amazing, so thank you so much also to them. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jessica Hellman. I'm the director of the Institute on the Environment here at the University of Minnesota, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the second annual Speaking Science Conference. At the Institute on the Environment, our job is to inform and to connect people around sustainability and environment issues across the entire University of Minnesota, all of our colleges and all of our campuses. And we work hard to link the university to practitioners, to decision makers, and to the media. It is crucial to our institute and to many other topics at this university, that we be able to link our scholarship to the broader public and to decision makers and speak clearly about what it means and why it is important and why we should take action and how we can inform that action. We will not be able to achieve sustainability without being able to communicate about what sustainability is in a way that is compelling, informative, interesting, and engaging. The other reason Speaking Science is so important to the Institute on the Environment is because it's an occasion where the whole university comes together. And in recognition of that whole university, I especially want to give a shout out to the folks who are watching from other campuses on our online stream. So hi, online folks. We're thrilled that you're here in person. Or cannot be here in person, but are joining us virtually. So I want to also point out, speaking of collaboration and multiple campuses, on the back of your program, we need to recognize all of the partners, formal partners who are part of putting together Speaking Science. It is one of the most impressive and most in terms of collaboration and active participation across the university. So thank you so much to all of those organizations and colleges and departments listed on the back of your program. But really, I'm up here, in addition to saying hello and good morning, my job is to introduce President Eric Kaler, 16th president of the University of Minnesota. I think probably most of you, I would guess by now all of you, know that President Kaler will be ending his tenure here as president of the University of Minnesota relatively soon. So this is a time where we are certain to tell him how grateful we are for the work that he has done to elevate our university and to grow it, its stature and its influence. And he pushes all of us, I feel his push, to be ambitious in our work and also to be relevant in our state and in our world. And we're very thankful for his efforts in doing that. And we wish him very well in the next stage of his own scholarly life. So please join me in welcoming President Eric Kaler.
You should. Thank you. Thank you, Jessica. Good morning, everybody. It's a special treat to be here, and I'm delighted to see so many faculty, graduate students, and especially members of the media who are with us today. This is the second Speaking Science event we've had on campus. Last year's was a terrific success, and we're excited to have it and you back again. We are a land-grant institution, and so that makes it especially important that not only do we execute groundbreaking research, but we communicate it well, not only amongst ourselves, but to the public. And here at the University of Minnesota, we have scholars studying a wide range of things, from literally astronomy to zoology and everything in between. And we have to ensure that the important results we generate, the discoveries we make, are communicated effectively with the public. We have a civic responsibility to the public to challenge and eliminate the dangers to our society caused by ignorance of science, whether that ignorance is willful or not. And that's true in normal times. And we are not in normal times. So it's even more critical that we as scientists, engineers, medical professionals take the initiative to explain to the public in clear and unambiguous language what we do, why it's important, and why it will make a difference not only today, but potentially for tomorrow in irrevocable ways. Now, when I was a graduate student here 40 years ago, and I was walking over here this morning and I was thinking 40 years ago we actually had winter in Minnesota. We don't really have that anymore, and I'm sure that's not due to anything but happenstance. But I studied using small-angle X-ray scattering the microstructure of complex fluids involving surfactants and their applications towards enhanced oil recovery because they could lower the interfacial tension between oil and water and release the oil that was trapped in the porous media, typically sandstones, but it really depended on ultimately the wettability and the condition of the sandstone and, of course, the production history of the oil wells to which this treatment was going to be applied. Clearly, I needed to learn science speaking better then as much as I do now. It's important to be able to do what you're about to learn how to do better, and I'm delighted that you're here. I hope you have a wonderful and spectacularly interesting day, and I'm pretty sure you will. Thank you for being here, and I'll turn the stage over to our superstar panel who will take it from here. But I should close with thanking Jessica Hellman, Christy Kremers, and others at the Institute of the Environment and the Office of the Vice President for Research who've worked hard to prepare the day you are about to enjoy. Have a good day. Thank you.
Well, gonna check that the microphone on, you can hear me. Folks in other parts of the state, you can hear me? As though I'd ever know. Good, oh, I see thumbs up from the control room. Hi, I'm Chris Kramer. I'm the Vice President for Research at the university, and I'm also a member of the faculty in chemistry. And I'm really excited to have been asked to host this faculty panel, which the goal is to discuss a little bit about how to engage with the media, with other audiences, where we're trying to tell a story. And I'm really excited about the 3 faculty members that we have here, who I'm going to give a super brief introduction to, and I'm going to let them expand a bit more as they like about their own background and experience, because I really want to use the time for this conversation on a series of questions that I hope you'll consider interesting and relevant. So starting with Christina Krohn, who is here at my nearest left. Christina is a medical doctor, and moreover spent time with NBC News, Global Health and Media, and also worked with the World Health Organization. And so she has unique experience, if you will, on both sides of the scientist, medical doctor, media equation. Also, next is Jane Kirtley. So Jane is a faculty member in the School of Journalism. Actually, she described being a member of the Ivory Tower contingent as her second career, so spent a substantial amount of time as a practicing journalist and brings that experience now to the academic work. And then finally, Mike McAlpine, who is a faculty member in mechanical engineering. And Mike's had a great deal of exposure recently because he's been doing stuff the media has really loved, like 3D printing of human body parts and bionic ears and eyes, and you can see how people would jump right on that. So with that as a start to the credentials and backgrounds of these people, I think I'm going to throw out some questions. The goal is to be a little bit conversational, not do the kind of boring, now you answer the question, now you answer the question. So hopefully we'll achieve that, and let's get started. So for my colleagues, I think I'll say, often we're asked to speak to an audience, and there are many different kinds of audiences. And even when it's a media interviewer, it could be that that particular media outlet, if you will, speaks to a particular audience. And so one challenge sometimes is to decide how you're going to pitch what you want to say to that audience or to that media. So let me I'll ask the panelists, and I guess I will be a little directive and maybe start with Michael, go to the far end. How do you adjust your message, and do you feel you need to, and if you want to go after that space?
Sure. Well, especially as an engineer, what we do obviously can range from the highly technical to something that the public is funding, and so you want to make sure that you can convey it in a way that the public understands where their research dollars are going, why it's important, and you'd be surprised that how technical the public can be. Actually, how technically savvy they can often be. But it's really important, and I think that's part of what we do as faculty when we do teaching. We have a way of, we understand how to take a message, how to take something that's highly technical and break it down into components that can be easily relayed to the audience. And so you need to really understand who your audience is. You need to understand what their motivations are, for example, educating the public. And you need to be able to take something that may be highly technical, but phrase it in a way that's attractive to them, that understands why it's important, and that also understands both the broader impact as well as the technical value as well. So I think that's a really important part of what we do. And I think that's the best way to foster continued creative, innovative research by making the public excited and aware of what it is that they're funding.
Maybe I'm going to pitch it next to Christina, especially since in the sort of health and medicine area, there's often a great deal of interest from the public. Everybody wants to live forever, of course. So,
And as a physician, whenever you're talking, you sort of gear things back to the patient. And if you can think of a patient who you would be talking to when you're talking to the media, it makes it much more personal. You're going to care more about that individual patient, that even if it's one in your imagination that fits the role that the media is asking you about, than you would about vague concepts. And you'll be more specific to the media in general. And that's true for almost all physicians. You always think back to the patient in front of you, and that's what you're trained to talk. That's who you're trained to talk to. So then when you talk to media, you end up being a little bit more relatable because you are really including that human aspect.
Thank you. And Jane, do you want to add something to this?
Well, I mean, my background is quite different from all of yours, I expect. But I was a lawyer for many years before I came here to the University of Minnesota, and I ran a nonprofit in Washington, starting at the age of 31. And when you're in the position of having to make legal concepts clear to lay people, that does require the ability to break things down into smaller boxes, to use language that is understandable, and to bear in mind that it's a different matter, and I think this is the equivalent for all of you, to talk to, for me, the Supreme Court reporter for the New York Times, and to talk to somebody who is working for an environmental newsletter and really doesn't have any background in law, but is contacting me because they have a question having to do with a legal issue. So I think, you know, the message I want to make sure I convey here this morning, and this may not be the time, but I want to do it because I want to make sure I get it out there. Your credibility is something that can be lost in a second. It's really important that you be not just crystal clear, but not obfuscate about things. If you don't know the answer, you should say that you don't know the answer. If there's an issue, a question where somebody's asking you about things like funding, you know, who's underwriting your research, you better not lie about it because they will find out. And these may seem like secondary issues, but they're not, because they directly undergird how credible the rest of your pitch is going to be, your discussion is going to be about the important research that you're doing.
Thank you. So I'll just wrap this up maybe by saying I also speak to a lot of audiences. As a chemist, you get asked to blow stuff up a lot. So, and I often think about, you know, the degree of engagement, not just with what I say. We've been talking about sort of what's the message, but also other aspects of engagement. So it turns out Mike and I exchanged email last night, and he said, "Should I wear a tie?" And I wrote back to him and I said, "I'm going to wear a tie because that's my shtick, you know, vice president for research." I said, "You shouldn't. It'll make you look elitist. You want to engage with the audience better." And really, at that level of thinking, sometimes if I go talk to grade school kids, you know, I would not wear a tie. I want to seem like could be one of their parents, for instance. I think establishing that rapport is pretty critical. And so I want to follow up a little bit with following on something Jane said, which is, so I saw a very sobering statistic. It's been making its way around for about the last year. The Edelman Trust Barometer is something that Edelman periodically goes out and does surveys. And they asked people, you know, what's your level of trust for academic experts, let's say. Turns out 62% trust academic experts. And then they asked them, what's your level of trust for someone who's like you? And the level of trust was 60%. So you could either be happy that, yeah, 62% trust experts, or you could say, just like any other member of the population, which says that, you know, maybe expertise isn't so valued anymore. Now, in fairness, they could have asked the question, who do you trust more about nuclear physics, and said a nuclear physicist, or, you know, somebody just like you. But in any case, I think that that is something that's kind of pervading our greater societal environment at the moment, that there's this distrust almost of expertise. So maybe if I could get people to talk a bit about the balance of how you establish your credentials, as Jane pointed out, without necessarily being off-putting about it and earning that trust. I'll let whoever picks up the microphone go first.
I'm going to say something just quickly, which is that, again, in my early career, when I was in my 30s, when I was trying to establish myself as the director of a national organization, I mean, again, this was a long time ago. This was in the 1980s, but we were talking about a time when women were not highly regarded and when young people were not highly regarded. I think things are maybe changing now. But again, I think that the critical factor was, I mean, there were times when I would go out and speak to the general public as opposed to talking to the press, where I would get feedback that would be something along the lines of, well, you're just so arrogant. And I thought, well, how do I get away from that when I'm trying to be precise, when I'm trying to be clear, when as an expert in my field of law, I know what the proper terminology is. It makes me angry when journalists or others fuzz that and make it imprecise, but how do you get past that? I think that's one of the biggest challenges, and I expect it would translate in your work as well, because you can come across as arrogant if you are an expert in your field. So what's the answer? I don't know that I have the actual final answer, but I guess I would say humility is the key. It really is. That does come through if you make it clear, and I think especially in the area of science where you're always discovering new things and theories change and knowledge changes. Of course you want to pitch the latest wonderful thing that you've just discovered or worked upon, but I think it's important to try to put that into context. That's not always easy to do because sometimes, especially the news media, are looking for that headline, which may actually misrepresent what your work is all about. But I think, again, humility, along with your expertise, is probably a quality to try to cultivate.
I have to second that. As a young female, sometimes I struggle a little bit more to look authoritative. So like I do wear my white coat, I do wear my stethoscope, but once I have those insignia of my profession and that part is clear, really showing that I care about the patient in front of me or the patient that I'm talking about. That the most important thing about this conversation is how it affects real people. And that sort of humility next to it and being authentic and truthful with that sort of caring makes it much more relatable.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. Actually, so I think a lot of times when people act as experts, they try to make themselves seem as smart as possible. But it really gets back to sort of what I said before, which is instead of approaching it as how do I make myself seem as smart as possible as the expert, if you instead approach it as how do I educate the audience that I'm speaking to? How do I make them understand and learn? That's what humility is about. Then it comes across as much more authentic because you're actually trying to help the audience understand rather than trying to show people, prove to people how smart you are, for example. And I think the other good point that was made here is about establishing a rapport. For example, we do 3D printing research, and so I gave a talk, for example, recently where there were kids in the audience and their parents were also in the audience. It was a science fair. And so the first question I asked was, how many of you have heard of 3D printing? And everyone in the room put their hand up. And then I said, how many of you have used a 3D printer before? And then all the parents put their hands down. And then I said, how many of you actually own a 3D printer? And then everyone put their hands down. So I actually learned a lot from that interaction, but also established a rapport with the audience and understood where they were coming from, and then was able to tailor my talk from there. So establishing a rapport and teaching and educating, helping the audience understand rather than trying to show off how smart you are the two key aspects there.
One thing in addition is at the med school, I'm busy. I'm seeing patients. I don't have time to know every journalist and what their background is and if they've been favorable to research or not favorable to research. And so I do rely on my PR department for some of that also. That's their job. They do that all the day long while I am off seeing patients. So if I'm contacted by a reporter, I'm going to send that off to my PR department to see, is this somebody who I should interact with or not? So that way, if it's somebody we know has already done a pretty good job in relating scientific research, then I'm going to be more comfortable talking with that person.
Yeah, so those are some really good insights, I think, and I'll just add one more, which kind of follows on the comments about humility, which is, you really don't want to seem like an outside expert. You want to seem like you're inside to the audience to whom you're speaking, and part of that is just showing often the excitement of what you're doing. And maybe relating it to the fact that you're grateful that there's federal funding behind it. So, it's taxpayers who provided the dollars perhaps to do it. And so you're really part of a greater system, and now you're trying to discuss what it is you're doing. Clearly, we could use more of those skills since a large fraction of the federal government is currently shut down that funds people doing science, engineering, medicine. Well, not so much medicine, NIH is open, but that's obviously a key constituency. So let me turn to a different conversation, which is you've been invited to do some sort of an interview and you've decided you want to do it. To what extent do you, ahead of time, try to craft some specific message you're going to push versus just being ready to respond to a range of questions you're not entirely sure of what the coverage might be?
I won't go into an interview if I don't know what it's about. So before an interview, I want to know the topic. I want to be prepared. As a physician, I'm being invited in as one of the experts. So I want to actually have the facts in front of me and know them well. I might not have specific phrases that I'm going to use, but I definitely have, I try to limit it to 3 talking points, that these are the 3 things that I'm going to try and make sure that I hit. If I can, I get questions ahead of time. If not, I want to at least know what is the general direction of the story going to be so that I can prepare and provide the appropriate information. 1, for the story to look good, and 2, to make sure everything is actually factual. I don't want to provide information that is not accurate because I thought something that wasn't true. So I'm going to double check anything that even I think I know this down, I'm going to double check it before I go into any sort of interview.
I would agree with all of that, although the nature of the work I do, where I'm talking about media law and media ethics, they're often driven by things that happened 10 minutes ago, and somebody's calling me up to get a reaction to it. Another example of the conversation I had yesterday with a reporter from an environmental newsletter, she sent me a link to something that she was going to be talking to me about, and that probably is something that has happened to you and will happen to you too. You obviously want to read that link and see what it says, but particularly in the legal area, for example, but in media ethics too, I'll often say, so my comments to you are going to be based on what you've sent me, but I can't attest to the accuracy of that. In other words, you need to be very clear, I think, about what you're talking about, what you can talk about, the framework in which you're speaking. That's not to say that it may not get distorted. It does sometimes happen that it does. And so, I try to use repetition as a technique. I try to keep saying the same thing over and over and over and over and over in hopes that eventually that will end up as part of the soundbite or part of the quotes in the news story. It's not to be pedantic. It's not to be a pain. It's just to make sure that there's clarity there. I guess especially when you're dealing with someone who may not have the same degree of expertise that you do.
To be perfectly honest, repeating things is also really helpful to the journalist. If you say the same thing in 3 different ways, hopefully one of those is more soundbiteable. And if you keep repeating it, just slightly differently, but the same thing, you're more likely that that will end up in the article in the end.
And I'll just third what Christina and Jane said, which is basically preparation is key, and preparation is not just about knowing all the facts and figures, knowing all the content of what you're going to describe, but then being able to drill that down into what are the 1 or 2 key messages that I want to get across to the person that I'm speaking to, and then repeating them over and over, so it gets that point across. You'd be surprised how often, if you end up going off the rails, going off message, you'd end up getting misquoted, and it could be a disaster. Oftentimes, people publish things after a phone call with you without checking with you with the quotes first. So you really have to be careful about that and stick to 1 or 2 key messages and repeat those over and over. So.
And maybe I'll follow up a little bit on this and say it's totally okay, by the way, if after you've agreed to do something, and even if you feel reasonably expert on the topic, it never hurts to do a little extra research. Even Wikipedia might help you. So I got invited to do an interview with one of the local television stations about why salt doesn't work to melt ice below minus 20 Fahrenheit or something. And I knew as a chemist why. And I knew about calcium chloride, but I didn't know until I went and did a little research that Wisconsin was putting cheese whey on the roads in order to melt their ice effectively. And, that was a fascinating bit of the story. So, you can enhance what you're going to talk about with a little bit of preparation. But I hear my colleagues saying, and I guess I also agree, that having a message ahead of time that is what you want to get across, that's why you agreed to take the interview, can be really valuable to honing how you're going to respond.
And I'd like to quickly flip that a little bit and remind you that if you don't feel you can answer a question, you can say that. In fact, you should say that. I once, many years ago, had the experience of going on Fox Business News. They had told me in advance that X was going to be the topic. Once I was on camera and it was live, they completely changed the topic on me. And I said, I'm sorry, that's not what I came here to talk about. I cannot address that question. And I also made a determination then and there that I was not going to go back on Fox News, Business News, because they clearly were not dealing with their interviewees in a straight way. I think that's a relatively rare occurrence, and I'm only mentioning Fox by name because that happened to be the outlet I was dealing with. I'm not saying they're the only ones or that they always do that. But it is, it's fair that if you're asked to talk about X and they blindside you with Y, to say, I'm sorry, that's not what I came to talk about. Just be prepared for that. It can happen.
Yeah, it's also an excellent point, I think, that after you've agreed to give an interview and you're putting your expertise out there and people are asking questions, you want to be responsive to some extent. So there is that tendency to feel like, well, I'm not 100% sure, but maybe I'll say this. And one really should avoid that, obviously, because, wow, that could be a huge audience that's getting a bit of misinformation or just a simple mistake, and that's an awful thing to have happen. Let me move in a different direction now and say, presumably the people in this audience, they've already clearly opened themselves up to the idea that they're going to be interested in trying to respond if someone comes to them and asks them for information about their expertise. But we certainly can go beyond being, just passively waiting for the phone to ring and university relations to somehow drill down and find us. What do you do, if anything, to try to sort of enhance your profile and let national media or various audiences that you'd like to engage with know about your expertise and potentially find you? Ooh, I've stumped the panel.
Well, I think one thing that we do is when we publish a major article, we coordinate with the press office here to do a press release. Part of that is to, of course, get the information on the article out to the public. But another part of that is because I know sometimes when we publish things that the media will be interested in the work, and it's good to actually have a platform ready to go that's been vetted multiple times through the university, ready to go that we can point to get the message out there in the way exactly how we want it before people misconstrue or before anyone else can define the message for you. So I think for us, at least in the engineering field, doing a coordinated, carefully crafted press release about our work to get the message out there as the way we want it to start the conversation. It gets our work out there, it gets our expertise out there, and it also allows us to craft the message rather than other people to craft it for us.
I would also say talking to your PR department so that they know that you are interested. That way, if somebody were to call the PR department for the med school, you would be someone that they could connect to. Another thing is writing op-eds about specific subjects that you are interested in wanting to talk further about. That's another way that many physicians have started to be involved with the media is once they write the op-ed, their name is out there, then they get contacted to talk more about that subject and neighboring subjects. When I was working at NBC News, we specifically didn't want to have any expert who we hadn't seen on TV already. So if that expert had a brief YouTube video of them talking about their area of expertise, that was enough for us to be able to say that person is good on camera, they seem to be knowing what they're talking about, they've been recommended already, and then we would contact that person. Whereas if we had 5 people who we were supposed to contact and only one of them had a video of them talking about their subject, that's the person that we talk to first.
So we've talked a little bit about things to avoid talking on subjects you don't know anything about. But what's a mistake you remember making you wish you hadn't made that we can help other people never make? Mike's ready to jump in.
You really have to be careful. So I'll give you an example. So sometimes when other people publish papers, they'll say, someone I know, for example, will say, we'll publish a paper, they'll coordinate something with an outlet, media outlet, and then they'll say, if you want a quote about my work, maybe go to Mike McAlpine and he'll give you a quote. You had to be careful because, one time I said about 100 positive things about the work, and then I said, I think what they need to demonstrate next as their next step is X, Y, Z. And then the way that they quote it in the article is they ignore all the positive things I said, and they said a big drawback of this work is they haven't yet demonstrated X, Y, Z. So, and then you have to, so this is a colleague who asked me to do this, and then that's how it comes out. So I think it's perfectly reasonable and legitimate and acceptable to tell the person that you're speaking to that you want to see what they're writing and approve it before they actually publish it, because otherwise they will just put it out there like that sometimes. Not that they're misquoting you, it's just the context is not quite right. And so you absolutely have the right to ask them to have the text approved by you before it goes out.
You have the right to ask. They're not necessarily going to say yes. I mean, let's get real. The reality is that, at least for the mass media, they're on deadlines and they're not going to have that luxury, even if on one level they know that that would be a desirable thing to do. I think that the mistake that I remember, and it doesn't really translate for this group, but since we're supposed to be sharing them, I will give you one. I was talking about a very famous U.S. Supreme Court case in the First Amendment area. It's one I teach all the time. I mean, I know it backwards and forwards, but for some reason, and I think it was because I was using the movie Capote in my ethics class for other purposes. I just meant, and this is the same case that led to Truman Capote writing In Cold Blood. Well, it wasn't the same case. It involved the massacre of a family in a farm community, but it was two totally different places. And it appeared in the Los Angeles Times, and I got a lot of perfectly appropriate criticism for messing that up. So I think it simply underscores the point that you need to be very careful of your facts if you're speaking for attribution.
I'm not certain this counts as a mistake, but it's definitely a learning opportunity.
We'll take those two.
So I was, pardon the cold, I'm getting a little bit hoarse here. I was writing a story about a new intervention in East Palo Alto where the police were specifically having outdoor time on playgrounds to play with kids and do outreach into the community. I thought that this was a great thing. I had heard about it first at a city council meeting, and I quoted one of the city council members who did not seem like the most upstanding citizen. And in the article, his comments were very negative about the program, very negative about providing funding for this, and I thought part of the way the article was written was, see, some people are against it, but this is really a good thing for the community, and you as a community need to decide, because he's one of your city council members. And the clinic that I worked for, all the interpreters and the community health workers were so mad at me for having quoted that man in the newspaper. I'm like, he's your city council member, like, if you don't like what he has to say, vote him out of there. But it was a really hard and awkward spot for me to be in one area working with the clinic and to have quoted and done something that came against them in their interpretation of it. So as much as I probably would do the same thing again, I definitely needed that with working with the media, I need to know who might be affected by it, how it might come back to me, and be a little bit more prepared for that.
That's a great opportunity to segue, since you mentioned a level of government, in this case city government. So sometimes the audience to whom you're speaking is a legislator or someone else with governmental authority. I'm interested in hearing thoughts about what you do differently when talking to that kind of an audience versus a more general media interview, if you have thoughts. It's a particularly propitious time to talk about this as the legislative session has initiated.
As somebody who has testified before Congress as well as a variety of state legislatures, although not here in Minnesota, I've never had, well, I did once, I guess. I think the thing that you really need to know before you go in is how well briefed the legislators are likely to have been. And my guess is the answer is going to be not very. And so you really do need to go in with the assumption that they don't know very much. And that's not denigrating them. I'm just saying even if they're on a specialized committee, their expertise is going to be in no way, shape, or form comparable to yours. So again, it goes back to what we were talking about before, being humble, not being arrogant, not talking down, but not assuming a level of knowledge. And again, what I said at the very beginning, testifying before any legislative body, if you don't know, say you don't know, and don't do anything but tell the truth, because they will kill you if they find out that you have misrepresented something. I mean, they will. And they will find out, the opposition will find out, the media will find out, and you'll be dead in the water. So it's a time for precision, and it's time for simplicity, and it's a time for accuracy.
I think what the legislators care about is their constituents, right? So for us, we're 3D printing biomedical devices, and so I tried to really convey the message that their constituents will be helped by this technology because it will save X number of lives, or will lead to this much reduction in alleviation of pain, or less time in surgery. So I think crafting a message that they can convey easily to their constituents, especially when you're talking about health and medicine, is particularly important for us. Basically taking the technical message and turning it into something that helps and improves the lives of the average person and the constituents.
I have to say, don't ignore the staffers. So as much as staffers change year in and year out, they're also the ones who decides what gets onto whose desk. So if you are wanting to meet with your representative or with your senator, make sure that you treat the staffer well. If you have an ask, which you should have an ask when you go to your representative or to a senator, make sure that the staffers know that and take the time to talk with the staffer so that they understand it also. Because if the staffers don't know or don't care, it's not going to sit on the representative or the senator's desk very long.
And I'll add a note of personal experience as well. I think there's a tendency, at least for me, I'm a physical scientist. I figure, boy, here's my chance to testify. I'm going to be armed with tables and graphs and data. Right? Data are how you convince people. And for the most part, if you can submit written testimony, great. Put the data in the written testimony. But what really reaches legislators, in my experience, are anecdotes. We hate anecdotes. They're the opposite of data, right? But boy, if you can tell one story that does have an impact on a constituent, for instance, that is really relatable to the audiences they are going to have to go talk to at some point. If they have to explain a vote, they're going to be talking to their constituents, to the everyday people who populate their meetings. So that can be much more powerful than some dry recitation of facts.
Yeah, let me give a very quick example. When I was at the Reporters Committee in Washington, we were testifying in Annapolis, Maryland, before the state legislature, because there was a bill there to close off access to criminal incident reports. And all of us who were representing the media were there with all of our high-minded First Amendment, public access, public accountability kind of language. And then a citizen came in to testify who happened to be an African American. And he said, I want to explain to you that this is a rich white person's bill. You are closing down access to this information because they're embarrassed about the fact that they've been the victims of crime. For people in my community, the only way I can be sure that law enforcement and the authorities will follow up is if it's public information, if the media are staying on top of it. That was the powerful statement. That's what made the difference. That's what stopped the legislation. So I can only agree an anecdote, a real anecdote, is absolutely one of the most powerful things to do.
So I have gotten the 1-minute high sign from organizers. I think that's a great place to wrap up. I would ask you to join me in thanking the panelists, who I think have done a fabulous job. And turning it over for the next panel.
we go. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Alicia Cohen. I'm the director of the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication, and I'm delighted to be here with my colleagues from the media industry. To my immediate left, we have Michelle Cortez, who is a science and technology and medical and health, I think I said, a reporter for Bloomberg News. And she's based in Minneapolis, but you can find her work in a number of publications, including the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, Globe and Mail, Sydney Morning Herald, and I left one off. Business Week? Is that what you said? Yes. And then to her left is Tim Blatz, who you may recognize as our Fox 9 anchor in town. He also is an alum of my school with a master's degree in strategic communication, so he can give you both the strategic communication side as well as a perspective from the broadcast industry. We're delighted to have you both here. Thank you for coming to our campus, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to kick our conversation off with a couple questions. I think the first one question that I'm sure many people in this room have is, for folks who haven't worked with the media before, what are some common tips you would give them to prepare, just to kind of think about their work before they even get a call from a reporter? What do you look for? What would you recommend? How could they prepare themselves?
Go ahead, sir.
Thanks so much for everybody coming out here, and I'm really excited to share my thoughts with you guys. So my understanding of what you guys all do is that you're in the research industry. What I do is I write about medicine and science. My background basically in this particular area was reading the New England Journal of Medicine and the Journal of the American Medical Society. I cover health and meeting researchers that way. If that's the kind of thing that you're doing, like that you're writing for doing research for major publications, for moving your field forward, in my mind, there's two things that you're doing. You're doing your own research. You have to communicate your findings and why that's important. The other thing that you might be doing is commenting on other people's research. As journalists, we're always looking for an outside expert, somebody who's not financially conflicted, who can explain why something else is great. Maybe because that original researcher isn't great at doing it himself. So if you can hone those skills, you'll be in high demand. What I would say is you just have to do it. And the easiest place to do it these days, I would say, is on Twitter. I would imagine that you're following other people in your field. I'm imagining that they're publishing things. Read their stories and say, or their publications and say, here's the thing that I found interesting about that, and start honing your critical thinking skills about what's interesting in someone else's work. And then when you're doing it on your own work, then you'll have a little bit more polish.
I think it all kind of comes back to, and excellent observation too, Michelle, is that what are you passionate about? You know, why did you start your research to begin with? What do you tell your spouse or your partner when you come home at night and said, I did this today? You know, and I think you have to look in the mirror and dig down and see what your passions are and why you got into the research that you did and what you were doing. And if you can find that spark about your own passions, you can tell your story to anybody. We were just backstage talking a few moments ago about a kind of a thing that I had a couple of years ago, more than a couple of years ago. I used to live in New Mexico before I moved here. And one of the people I had a chance to meet through JDRF at the time, the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, was Dr. Phil Eaton. Dr. Eaton is an endocrinologist and researcher at the University of Minnesota Medical School. And he was around a cocktail table at a cocktail party in Albuquerque maybe about 30 years ago, 25 years ago. And they were all introducing themselves and sharing what they did professionally. And it got to Phil Eaton's turn, and he said, well, I'm an endocrinologist at the U, and my life work and my passion is to try and find an artificial pancreas and create an insulin pump. But my hiccup right now is I can't find a pump that's just small enough and precise enough to deliver the minute amounts of insulin. And two of the other gentlemen at the table looked at him and he says, well, my goodness, we've got those kind of pumps on a nuclear weapon. Why don't you come over to our lab at Sandia Labs next week and we'll show them to you. And that started the conversation for Phil Eaton, all because he expressed what he was passionate about and told his story, and someone else took an interest in it and said, I think we can help you. And so if you can find those kinds of interesting passions inside of you, again, you can tell your story to anybody.
Both of you cultivate different types of stories in broadcasting and in print. Can you talk to them about, what you're looking for what makes a good story for your genre, for your work, and how do you reach out to academics in your work?
Go ahead.
So you guys might have noticed that the media world has changed. There was a day when there was a day truly when my executive editor said to me, or maybe it might have even been Mike Bloomberg, who said, anything that anyone else has, we want to have. So anyone published anything anywhere, we wanted to be writing about it. That was arduous days, a lot of work back then. Then Matt Winkler, who was our editor-in-chief, said, what we want is anything that changes the way people think about the world. So if there's work out there that's fundamentally changing anything that you think about the world, then we want to write about that. Currently, what we're doing is anything that grabs people's attention. So, people are looking for viral stories. I write for Bloomberg. Obviously, we have a very big financial angle. So I wrote a story this week. Somebody pitched me about a tiny little device that's used in newborn hearts. And so I sent it to my editors, and I was like, it's for premature babies up to 2 pounds. Like, there's no possible way that there's going to be a financial angle here. You just can't sell enough of these things for it to be a big money maker. It's sold by Abbott Laboratories. They were just getting approval. But my editors were interested in it because, guess what? They had a premature baby who had this problem, and so that's why they were interested. So you never know when you find what the right angle was. I wrote the story, got a lot of attention, pretty basic, but you just don't really ever know. So for me, financial angle and then compelling human interest.
This is going to sound very elementary, but it kind of goes back to one of the first things we did in grade school and in kindergarten, and that is show and tell. You all pursue academic research and scientific research that you have to demonstrate at some point to somebody. And in addition to being researchers, I know a lot of you are teachers as well. So it's just ingrained in you to show and tell things. And if you can demonstrate something or show how it works, the power of that mechanism as a storytelling feature is so unique and so powerful, and especially in my medium, in television. Let me give you a couple of examples here. I did a story once at Los Alamos. When I lived in New Mexico, I did a lot of stories up in Los Alamos National Lab and Sandia National Labs. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, you're in the science community, so I won't insult your intelligence too much. But Los Alamos does a lot of the pure raw research on nuclear weapons and other science too. It's managed by the University of California, so they do a lot of pure scientific research up there. And then Sandia Labs is kind of the engineering division where they put it all together. Up at Los Alamos in the X division, this is the X division, the division of scientists that are really looking at the basic math of nuclear weapons. They built this giant TV screen, and at the time I went up there and did this story, it was the largest television screen in the world at the time. I mean, it was bigger than the Jumbotron that the Dallas Cowboys have inside their stadium. And when you were inside the lab, I mean, it was 2 stories tall, probably by 3 stories wide. And the whole reason why they developed this is so that they could assign the mathematical equations. The moment that plutonium core starts to collapse, it produces a bunch of math, right? And so they assigned a different color to each one of those mathematical equations and then splashed it up at the screen in literally nanosecond by nanosecond that core starts to collapse. They'd have different colors up on the screen. And the scientists could look at that and say, okay, mathematically, here's what's happening here, here's what's happening here, here's what's happening here, all by the different colors that were displayed on that giant television screen. So it helped them visualize their math and as to what was happening. Oh my God, that was a great story. And because you could see it happening in front of you. And so it's those kinds of things that if you can demonstrate to an audience, man, you're just going to really seal that story, that concept of what you're doing, in not just in the minds of your audience, but man, their hearts and souls too.
So I would jump in right there and say, that's great and absolutely true, especially for broadcast. But on my end, you know, print, and we have a podcast as well, you have to also be able to articulate that vision in words. Things are better now because we can embed graphics, the kind of graphics that are amazing. You can embed a video, so you can do that. But in terms of your pitch, it's really, I mean, I can't even tell you the number of times where researchers have drawn me a picture and I'm like, that's a great picture, but that is not going to go in my story. So, you know, if you can come up with your own graphics or can articulate the vision, that's very helpful for me.
So last year, a conference attendee said something like this, quote, "I worry about sleek and to-the-point messaging that doesn't gloss over details and promises easy answers. My research is complicated." I hear this all the time, but it's complicated. It is complicated sometimes. What advice do you give to scientists who have complicated ideas to present? Do you have any easy answers to give us?
Do you have any easy answers?
You know, I reflect back often on Dr. Amy, who would always tell us to put it in human form. You know, how is this going to affect people? And how are your outcomes going to make our lives better? And again, it comes back to your passions and why did you get into this? I mean, we all know here at the University of Minnesota we're driven to discover, but you're also driven to make people's lives better. How does your research helping your neighbor? How is it helping your students? How is it helping your patients? And I think if you can take that complicated research that you're doing, and I don't want to say dumb it down, that's not what we're saying at all, but how do you make it real to your audiences? And by the way, as many of you know, it's not just an audience for a publication, but it's an audience for your grant makers. It's for the people who fund your research. It's for, you know, your peers and your peer review process. You know, how can you make it real and understandable to them too?
Usually what I like to tell people is to think about how you can invite people in to want to discover more, what insights, what makes your research different from others. We have to do this all the time for tenure and promotion committees to non-expert experts. And similarly, I think that, not assuming that the audience doesn't want to know those details is helpful. In other words, I think that we don't give the audience enough credit sometimes for when someone is going to Bloomberg, they have a level of education and interest in financial and health information that's genuine, and they're information seekers in that context. And so that possibly gives you some opportunities in terms of how you think about the audience for your stories as well. Michelle, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I would say, and this might be jumping ahead a little bit because, you know, my main recommendation for people who are in your shoes is to know your audience. That's the most important part. I go to a lot of medical conferences. I listen to a lot of presentations. I read a lot of science. I tell you what, there's almost nothing there for me. You know, when you see the bullet-pointed slide of, 3 bullet points, here's my conclusion, this is what we take away. It's in technical terms. It's for people in that community. Now, if they said something to me, if they had put up something that was along the lines of, maybe revolutionary for whatever, everybody in their community would laugh at them. Like when you take it back to a 30,000-foot view, when you're talking to experts on an expert level, they're expecting a certain level of precision and detail and accuracy, and if you don't deliver it, you're discounted. But when you're talking to people who aren't at that level, you have to be able to as you were saying, to invite them into the story. So it's the same thing that you have with anything else that you're doing. If you're doing a job interview, if you're asking for money, if you're talking to your neighbor, you need to be able to explain very broadly what you're doing in terms of the area that you're going to be influencing. And then as you get more technically involved, you walk into it. And you'll find that, and you'll see this as you're reading newspaper articles, I constantly get in this problem where my editors cut my stories generally by about half, and I'm not even kidding about that, and it's terrifying, it's terrible. But it's because all those bits that they're just not interested in. They're not interested in the results of this study. They're not interested in the data. They're not actually interested in the findings. They're interested in, what does that mean? Why should I care about this? What's the impact on anything? It doesn't necessarily have to be an impact on survival or quality of life. It could be an impact on, on something very, specific to what you guys are working on. If you're changing the understanding of a particular area, but why do we care about that? Not the actual results of what you found. That's frustrating for me. But you will find an audience of people who care about that. And as you walk people through the details and they understand the broader picture, then you can engage them smaller. But as you're reading any kind of science or a newspaper article, notice the parts that you skip over. And then those are the parts that other people probably aren't interested in reading about your research. Just saying.
I want to change tacks just a little bit. So we also need to be good interviewees as academics and scientists. Everyone has limited amounts of time. You try to get people on the phone or to come down to the studio or on air all the time. What are some tips or tricks for preparedness, for being a good interviewee, making sure that you're well represented in the public?
Be yourself. I know that sounds very basic. You are your own best advocate, your own best spokesperson, but you're not a machine too. Be yourself. And again, I often tell people, look, we're not sitting down for an interview. We're at the bar having a beer and talking about some really cool stuff that I know you're passionate about. Show me your passion, and let's talk about let's have a conversation. This is not an interview. Let's have a conversation about the really cool stuff that you're working on, and why it's important to you, and how this is going to help people. And I think we lose sight of that a lot of time, even as journalists when we talk to people. We not only do we want an insight into your research, we want an insight into you, because we're going to find out a lot about what makes you tick by your passions and your research that you're working on.
See, so I completely agree with that, but also it's a point of knowing your audience. So when you're talking to Tim, he's not, if you're just chatting in the bar, you're probably not going to be talking about p-values or statistical significance. You probably aren't going to be talking about the backstory of how something works. So you have to know that that's what you're going into with Tim. Mm-hmm. For me, I really find I have no science background. I have no journalism background. So for me, in order to write about it, I have found that I actually need to understand what you're doing. So when I'm doing an interview with someone on a topic that I'm not familiar with, it's an hour. And generally, every single bit of that hour will inform what I write, but probably only, maybe 2, at the outside most 6 sentences, and rarely 6 sentences, will be attributed to that person who spent an hour with me. But every single bit of that information that they shared informs how I understand the topic. So be willing to have that conversation and know that when you're talking to me, I am going to be asking, well, what about this? What about that? And we're going to go down all these paths that aren't relevant to aren't relevant to the story that I'm writing, or really relevant to your findings, but that are just interesting asides. And I would also say that maybe it's better to talk to your spouse or your neighbor or me before you would go and talk to Tim, because he's really not interested in those details. So you need to be in a bar chatting with him, but you need to be at your lab space showing me the way that the details work.
I think that another item or kind of a way to consider how to go about putting ideas together is to think about those conversations with journalists just as you would pitches to federal agencies. And so if something is significant, explain how that's significant to the person that you're having that conversation with. They are going to assume that you have some expertise and want you to teach them a little bit about it.
Well, I want to jump in right here and share a University of Minnesota story. So obviously I write about science and medicine. CRISPR is a very big issue right now. So I'm interested in it. I have written about it, but only very much in passing. It turns out I have a son who attends school here, and he has friends. One of them happens to be working in a lab that's doing CRISPR. So this goes back to understanding your audience, but also really understanding. I would say that you should ask. You know, when you're talking to a reporter, like, what is your background? And do you want me to walk through all the details with you? I always say yes to that because I want all the details. Maybe Tim says no, maybe he doesn't want all the details.
No. Absolutely. That's a great starting point. Because a lot of times, you are the experts in your field. We're not. And so and a lot of times I'll see, I'm going to ask some really naive and dumb questions here. Forgive me. I don't know your subject matter like you do. So educate me.
Right. And don't assume that they don't want it or that they know anything. So anyway, so my point is so my son has a friend who's working in a CRISPR lab, and she's like, hey, why don't you come in and see the lab? And so I was like, yeah, that would be fabulous. So she brought me in, and she was showing me all these things. She was showing me how she counts cells. She was showing me, all the different laboratories, how she spins things out and all that kind of stuff. And so then we're walking, I'm leaving, and I said, well, when are you going to show me the CRISPR part? And she said, well, this all is CRISPR. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? Like, where are you doing the CRISPR? And she's like, oh, I do it right here in these cells. And for all of this writing about it and understanding it, I didn't understand that CRISPR was, that it was a product. That you are transducing a cell with a product. I thought that it was a process. And so, I was literally walking out of the door of having had my CRISPR, lab review and didn't even understand fundamentally what CRISPR was at that point. And I've done a podcast on CRISPR. I've done a lot of stuff on that. But it's just astonishing how sometimes there are very basic pieces that you don't understand.
Beyond just interviewing, some of us might be a little bit camera shy. What advice do you have for getting in front of the camera or in front of a microphone? I think that Tim is besides
and
just
both
being
of us,
yourself,
because Michelle does
is,
podcasts too, and
Yeah.
I think that's another conversation I'd like for us to get into about the different channels that we have these days too. I think the most important thing is to relax. Just relax.
Are you advising them to drink before?
Sometimes that helps. But no, I can tell when somebody is really wired and they're really nervous and I really go out of. Look. If you're doing a television, it's intimidating. We bring in lights, and you've got a guy standing behind me that looks like he's on loan from NASA with all this gear that he's wearing and batteries, and we got cables, and we're going to put a little microphone on you, and it's very intimidating. I'm not going to lie to you because it's out of your norm, right? And so I really try to go out of my way just to make people comfortable and relax, and usually, I always tell them, we're just to. I said, look, this is not a hard-hitting interview, or at least, we're not interviewing a murder suspect or something like that. You're doing some really cool things. If at some point you want to rephrase something, let's redo that, okay? So it kind of goes back to the golden rule. Treat people the way that you'd want to be treated yourself. And another trick that I've kind of learned over the years too is if you take the time and explain to them, we're setting up some lights here because we want to make you look good, and we're going to turn out the overhead lights, and I really think you're going to like how you look on TV, and when you,
Said no one ever.
I know,
Said no scientist ever.
no, yeah, right. But I've kind of learned over the years that when you go out of your way to at least make people feel comfortable, if you ever have to call them back, they will most likely say, yeah, come on back over. So, and that's kind of on our end, right? So,
some tips from the academic on our side is take a picture of yourself before you go out the door. If you don't like what's in the picture, what you're wearing, you're not going to like it better when it's on TV, right? HD doesn't improve the situation. You know,
I can't tell you how many times over the years,
dark
too.
Black, you know,
Yeah. I can't tell you, especially with guys.
Yeah.
You know, how many times I've said, hey, let me help you. So I'll tighten up the tie a little bit. Let's you know, move up your jacket here a little bit. Let me help you with your lapel, and you know, let's get a little gap behind the suit coat. So again, I've just found that it helps me in the long run if I ever want to call someone back again and say, hey, can we come back over again?
On the flip side, I think that it bothers us who are on camera more than it bothers the people who are doing the interview, right? We're supposed to be the experts in whatever we're talking about. We're not the on-camera talent, per se. We're not supposed to look better than the person interviewing us, necessarily. I mean, we don't do this every day. So I would just say not worrying about it as one of the pieces of being a little camera shy is fine. It's not a reason to not go public with your information. And my other piece of advice in that line is if you're not doing it, if you decline the interview, if you can suggest someone else who should, if you don't have the expertise, that's very helpful because the goal is to get more people with the appropriate expertise into the public, you know, sphere rather than fewer. And so figuring that out or having a buddy, if you don't like to go on camera, but who is a really good representative of your work, can sometimes work for people too. When we are trying to translate research to convey its importance, do you have any tips or tricks that you've seen people use to really get more mileage out of their work? You know, do you know how people are able to help you make stories go viral? Michelle, thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, I think the issue, well, so I want to go back to the previous question, which was on, you know, being on camera. I personally believe, you know, two things, going back to what I'd said before. You can do videos of yourself. You can just do it on your phone. You can have your kids help you or your students. I don't think that any of you should be not doing that. I think all of you should be doing that. You probably are on camera, I would imagine, like, you know, with your presentations, your class sessions and whatnot, they're videoing some of those. So go back and look at some of that and maybe post it on Twitter or on Facebook, you know, if you really want to be into that, because truly what I learned from doing my podcast is that there's no alternative, there's nothing better than experience. And so we only did 8 of them, but the difference between the first one that we did and the 8th one that we did is dramatic. And that was only 8 times. So if you can get into the habit of doing that, I would really encourage that. And I think that that would be helpful for you going forward, knowing what you're going to be doing. And now, I'm sorry, I lost.
So the second question was just how can we be better translators to the public?
Yeah.
What helps with virality?
Right. Well, so the you know, what would you would say normally is, you know, have some zingers practiced. Oh, and that's why I wanted to circle back, because yeah, you guys aren't, you know, you're supposed to be the expert. Be who you are and own who you are. Like if you're going to be whatever kind of person you are, no matter you dress it up, you don't dress it up, be the person you are every single day and know that what you're doing is valuable and worthwhile. And truly, I think we see over and over again, there's this perception in the United States, particularly in the Western world, that being very polished, being, you know, having your hair all in exactly the right place, having the right makeup or the right clothes, that's so important. But you look over and over again, now that we've democratized our world and you can get information from anywhere, it's not the most beautiful people who tend to be getting, you know, the most accolades. If you watch The Voice or Survivor or something like that, the people who are generally beloved are not the beautiful people. They're just not. So own who you are, and then every time you show up, you're going to be the same person. So practice, but don't try to change who you are. And then that comes back to the point of, you know, trying to practice something that's going to go viral. It's just, it's just not going to work. I mean, you can try it, you can work on things, but I think it goes back to what Tim said earlier. If you're passionate, that'll come through. And just, own who you are, find the points that you're going to say, and it'll come to you.
You talked about something going viral. Every brand in the world is trying to find the formula for making information, videos, pictures go viral. And at the end of the day, you don't get to decide that. It's the audience that gets to decide it. And yes, there are certain structures, and we could walk you through all the points that it needs for something to go viral. But at the end of the day, we don't decide that. It's the audience who does, largely based upon, is it different? Is it new? Is it a new spin on something that we haven't seen before or they haven't seen before? So there's, and getting back to Michelle's point too about just being yourself, I think it's just so critically important, because people see right through you if you're trying to pretend to be somebody that you're not. And there's nothing more obvious in the world, and it's just being true to yourself and being, and maybe you are that researcher who is not the most outgoing person in the world. Sometimes that can be an asset for you too. And there's I come from a family of engineers, right? I'm the only non-engineer in my family, so I can say this joke, but there's an old joke about engineers about what's the difference between an introverted engineer and an extroverted engineer. Anyone know it? The extroverted engineer looks at your shoes when he's talking to you. So, but be who you are, and I think that will go a long way.
I want to come back to an earlier question that asked like tips, how you could if you want to break into the media space, if you want to do it. What I would say, the experience that I've had is finding somebody who is independent, who has an opinion and is willing to share it, is a difficult thing, someone that you can trust as a reporter. Now, I would imagine that you guys all know who the reporters are in your area. Like, who's going to be most likely to cover a story? Who do you talk to? Whose stories do you read? And what I would do is when this is just an idea, but when they write a story, I would send them back a copy of their story and say, I thought this was really interesting. Don't be critical, because reporters can get their, don't do that. But you could say, here's a really interesting thing, or if you're ever looking at it for this, not because I want to sell you my research, but here's an interesting thing to think about. As you're reporting on this area, I think you might find this interesting, and see if you can build up a rapport with reporters. There is an entire group of academics out there who do things like, as soon as there's a story that's published, they will send you a comment for your story. So, and it's great, and they're trying to be viral. They're trying to be really pithy and send you something interesting, and you'll see. If you go and read, like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, you will see the same people again and again and again. And that's because they actually are getting those things fed to them by an academic, an outside expert who is just, launching out their commentary. I wouldn't recommend that, because then it generally works for a while, and then everybody is like, oh, we don't like that person. But if you're really interested, find a person whose work you really respect and try to engage with them. And so then you will find that they'll be coming back to you and saying, hey, what do you think about this particular thing? What do you think? Then you'll get your experience, advising them, and they'll get the benefit of your knowledge, and that's a win-win.
I want to give the audience an opportunity to ask questions. I believe that Brad and Dan have some mics.
Yeah, we have some mics, and Brad has to steal one off the stage because of poor planning on my part. And we would like to open it up to questions from the audience for this panel. We've heard from them. We've heard some interesting insight, and we'd be glad. And I'm going to ask our participants to introduce themselves very briefly with their question. So we have a first question over here.
Hi, my name is Marie. I work in the horticulture department, and my question is, when you're working with a controversial topic or method, how do you approach talking to the public about it? Do you meet it head on, or do you avoid talking about the controversy?
I love controversial topics, and this is something that I think that I've learned over time. As a person, I avoid controversy. Like, I don't like to, I can't talk to my family about politics, the whole bit. But when you're in journalism, and I would imagine from your perspective as well, you just don't take it personally. You just say, oh, people are really are saying this about you or saying this about your topic. How would you respond to that? And assume that people want to share their side of the story. And then you get both pieces. I tend to be a pretty boring writer, I think. And so I like to lay it out. This is what this person says. This is what that person says. There is definitely areas of the news where they like to pump up the controversy and they make it worse rather than better. But again, know your audience. I personally think controversy is great and it makes people more engaged.
I would agree. It makes the topic more interesting to a lot of people, too. It makes it more salient to them. My advice to you is I think you have to address it head on, but you also need to know, you need to know your research, and you need to know your story to prove why your story, why your research, why the issues that you're working on are so important. And I think the other thing that's critical to understand too is the points of view where the criticism is coming from. Why are they criticizing the research? So that you know exactly where the criticism is coming from, so that you can argue against it, or at least stand your ground as to why your research is so important and why you're pursuing that particular path or policy that you're doing. What's the policy that your research ultimately supports? I think if you go into a controversial topic like that, not understanding where the opposition is coming from, you might be doing yourself more harm in the long run.
Thank you. In the back.
Okay, I'm Heidi Eschenbacher from the Institute on Community Integration. We do research on people with disabilities and about the supports they get. And we had an instance where we had some data that was completely misinterpreted despite our best efforts to convey it to the reporter. What do we do when our data is misused? How do we respond?
Did you call back that reporter or the news organization and say, I think there's a problem here, that the outcomes of the story is not reflective upon what our research is?
Yeah, and we did, and there just really wasn't much follow-through in this particular instance. And it was a television story, and it was also framed in such a way that was pretty biased and not the way we want our data conveyed.
Mm-hmm. I think, yes, unfortunately, that happens from time to time. I hope that it wasn't our news organization that it was, and if it was, you have my apology to you, and I'd like to circle back around. It was?
It was.
Okay, we will talk afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Every station has a news director, and so they're, beyond the particular reporter, whose job is to, and producers whose job it is to book and to manage relationships, and so. Unfortunately, in broadcasting or live, it's hard to issue corrections after the fact that are differences that makes a difference, possibly in the online version of the story, but not often. In print and online, versions, corrections are more likely to appear, and most journalists would rather have a correction than spread misinformation. And
Absolutely.
I think that's they're usually, as Tim was, horrified by that, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's an easy situation to correct.
Well, I have a feeling that it might have been an effort to go a little bit viral, to make something seemingly more controversial than perhaps it was. And we see that a lot. I would say on the print side, if there's ever a correction, read the story as soon as it comes out if you're contributing to something, and reach out to them and say, hey, I think that you might not have understood something specifically. Also know that you can't dictate how anything is going to be changed, but if you approach someone on the print side and you do it immediately and you do it politely, I mean, I don't know anybody who wouldn't immediately update their story. And generally, it's not things that are in print anymore, so you can do it. And if you get it within the first, hour or two, that story probably hasn't gotten out there too terribly much at that point, so it's easy to change. If you wait a day or two, it makes it much harder. So I would say don't wait at all. The other thing, and this is what really frustrates me so much about the whole fake news label, whether it's mainstream media or other things, there has never been a time in the world where people's access to immediate sources is more available. So I would say, sure, probably tens of thousands of people perhaps watch that, whatever, but you have the ability to put out your own commentary on Twitter, on Facebook, on your website. You can respond to if they put it up on, exactly. And so that's where that's going to live forever, and you're the one who's the owner of what your findings are. So don't let the fact that somebody else maybe mischaracterized your findings. Don't let that sway you. And the other thing is that really there's not that many people who are watching this stuff, and none of it sticks really all that much. So don't take it too personally.
If it only was that easy, right?
Right. And Michelle makes an outstanding point here, is that what's online lives there. I mean, it lives there in perpetuity, so you can always look it up and do a Google search. And if you find that your research has been mischaracterized, or if there's an inaccuracy, again, if you can get back to the producing organization as fast as you can, so that they can make the correction online, that's really critical. Look, this has happened to me a lot, where even stories that I don't do, I'll have somebody call me up and say, hey, Tim, we saw the article that was posted online, and there was one sentence in there that was inaccurate, or could you look into it? And I've looked into it, and I've verified it, and I've gone to our web producers, and I say, we need to change that right now. And so we'll get it approved, and boom, it can be done literally within minutes.
And I would just take this, how to do this one step further. Rather than calling and saying, that story was really biased, that's like a trigger warning for journalists. I was say, when the story said X, Y, and Z, it made it look like X, Y, and Z. It would be more accurate if it said, give them the language then. Do you think this could be corrected before this time? Corrected. Or not corrected? What would you use? Updated. Clarified. Because we'd like to respond online. Yeah. And so that gives them some time.
Well, I have to say, if there is something that's a correction, and especially at Bloomberg, and I imagine other news organizations are the same, like I don't want anything that's factually incorrect out there. But what we're talking about in a lot of cases is implication. And if someone's implying something, then you could argue if that's accurate or not accurate. So you don't want to get into, and you don't want to, say, could this be updated? Could it be included? That kind of perspective. We wrote a story, one of my colleagues for Business Week wrote a story about Alzheimer's disease, a phase 2 trial in 42 patients, 6 weeks they were followed, and the headline was something like, Family Biotech might cure Alzheimer's disease. And then after it ran, there was this huge hullabaloo on Twitter. I mean, I'm telling you guys, you have power outside of the news organization. And so then everyone started calling me, right, because I write about the science, and they're like, well, what should we do about this story? And I'm like, oh my God, why are you asking me now? And how on earth do you correct nuance? Yeah, this 42-patient study might cure Alzheimer's disease. Like, there's 2 farmers, and the mother-in-law was doing some research, and so they created a company, and now $100 million have been invested in it. It might be the cure. Chances are not. The story didn't have anything about the billions of dollars that have been spent on Alzheimer's research, the failure after failure after failure that it's come. And so, we tweaked the story at that point as best we could. But sometimes there's just not anything you can do. Sometimes you just have to take the hit and move on. I'm going to give 2 other quick examples. I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm hogging. So the story that I was saying earlier about the little tiny device that they put in the hearts of these kids, these premature babies. So The situation there is, I was characterizing it as a hole in the heart. It's technically not a hole in the heart. I don't know if any of you guys are on the medical side, but that's, it's a different thing. Usually when you're talking about a hole in the heart, you're thinking about it that it's between two ventricles. In this particular case, it was right outside of the heart. It was the arteries and the blood vessels that actually fuel the heart. So it wasn't technically in the heart. But man, if I started having to talk about the aorta and the pulmonary artery and how the hole is there and how it works, so I used all the right terms, but I characterized it as a hole in the heart. Anybody who actually knew enough about that story to know that I was wrong, that it wasn't technically a hole in the heart the way that doctors consider it, if they read the rest of the story, patent ductus aureus, they would have known exactly what it was. And so a couple of people came back to me, and I went to my editors, and they're like, yeah, it's a hole in an artery that's right outside the heart. If it's a hole in the heart, it's a hole around the heart of a 2-pound baby. Move on from that particular issue. So that story is out there. Another story that I did, I was talking with the head of NIH. He's doing research. He was doing early research with this one organization, with this one publicly traded company, and he had since switched over and licensed his new technology to another company. When I was writing about the story, I was talking about how the second company is the one who actually has the patent licensing to it, which is true going forward, but a lot of the research was predicated on the first company. The first company lost their minds, because it's a publicly traded company, their stock fell, and the other company's stock rose. But the bottom line is that the NIH people were saying, this is where that's gonna go. So even though the original company had a point, the story didn't change, because when you're talking about where the implications are, it's somewhere different. And so then how we handled that is I talked to the original company and wrote about their technology, which honestly isn't going to work, but still, that's the way it goes sometimes.
All right. Sorry. One over here. Sorry.
We only have time for this one question.
Oh.
My name is Kylie Friedrich. I'm part of the Department of Entomology, and my question for you is really relating to media and communication changing, how millennial and Gen Z voices are starting to dominate those spaces, and how are you watching media or changing your tactics accordingly as we see a new way of information finding and information gathering happening with a younger generation?
That's a great question, because the landscape is literally changing before our eyes. And we see it even in our newsroom with because we've got a lot of millennials now in our newsroom, and we see the different ways that they consume news. And most people of that generation now are consuming. I don't have my phone on me. I'm not a millennial. I don't have it on me. They're consuming their information on this device right here, and not just news, but how they're getting their news, whether it's on Twitter, whether it's on Instagram, okay, whether it's on Facebook, whether it's on. My daughter is a great example. I've got she's about to turn 21, and I asked her, where are you getting your news? And she says, from the BBC. And she's got the BBC app on her phone, and that's how she consumes her news, is from the BBC, because she perceives that as a credible news source. I've got another daughter who's a senior in college, and she is she's a fine artist, okay, and she's studying dance and drama at UW Stevens Point, and she could care less about the news because she's a fine artist. So, but we see it in our newsroom, and especially how people are consuming their news, and it's on a mobile device. It's not necessarily on their TV screen at home. If they're watching a TV screen at home, it's for Netflix. So we are seeing how people are consuming news differently, and not in traditional ways, but on different channels. When I'm talking about channels, I'm talking about different platforms and how and where those are going from Facebook to podcasts, as Michelle was talking about here too. Those are becoming an explosive channel for getting information out there too, because you've got people captive in their cars, and they can easily stream it through their phone and onto their new audio device in the car. So the landscape is changing before our eyes.
And to answer specifically, I'm doing a podcast, I'm on Twitter, we have a social media team that's got me doing this TikTok stuff, and I posted one of my flu stories on LinkedIn, which I'm terrible at. But truly, you know, I'm an older woman. I'm not going to ever be in that demographic. So what I'm doing, what I'm working on very earnestly, is empowering my younger colleagues to own that space, because it's really not going to be me. I'm working hard at it, but it's just not going to come.
Well, thanks a lot. I want to thank our panelists, Alicia, Michelle, and Tim. We're going to move on to our next segment, but this has been really informative, really helpful, and I hope you guys were happy to be able to hear directly from some great media outlets. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. If you could all stand with me, set your things down. For those of you that were here for the opening with Neil McKay, he talked about the medicine of the bear. And we're going to do a little exercise that's really good for public speaking called bear claws. It's a very technical term that I came up with, and it's actually a Kundalini yoga move that you can do anytime you have a job interview, anything for public speaking. And improv is all about getting outside of your comfort zone. And as academics, that's the thing that we're most afraid of oftentimes, is getting outside of our expertise, right? And to be effective and to have the kinds of change we need to see in the world, it's going to take us getting outside of our comfort zones. And that's the beauty of improv. And so as part of Speaking Science, we have this new improv series called Speaking Science Improv. And so we have 10 sessions throughout the academic year to work on these skills of using our physicality to connect with our breath, to be in the moment, to connect with others. And so this might be a little strange. I hope it is, maybe. And so I want you to get your bear claws out. Feel the energy of the bear in your fingertips, and then you're going to inhale up and exhale down. Inhale up and exhale down. All right, and shake it out. So by doing that over and over again, and you can take a seat, you actually lower your cortisol levels and raise your testosterone. And so you may have heard of Amy Cuddy's TED Talk on power posing. This is a power pose that you can do. And I learned the power of this when I was student body president. I served 2 terms as graduate professional student body president, and they announced the closure of the graduate school. And this was when President Brunix was here at the university. And it was a complete shock to me and other folks, and suddenly we had to come up with a plan. And you know, normally I'm pretty easygoing, and I've never been so angry in my life. And I realized that to be effective in my position, I had to channel that anger in a different way. And so I stumbled upon the importance of physicality in this when I was going for a long marathon training run. Some of you know that there's a marathon training not by plan or design, but it was an emergency situation. So I show up to the provost's office with my running tights on, pigtails, and I'd just been listening to AC/DC Thunderstruck. And I came in there and I gave them hell. And there may be times where you have to find this part of yourself that you couldn't readily access, that's not normal to you, to be effective in that context. And improv helps us get that flexibility in the way that we communicate with others, the way that we access our presence, and the way that we connect. And so we're going to share with you a short video about this series, and we hope that you will join us throughout the year. It's just such a wonderful opportunity to network, but also to find ways to be better public speakers. And many of us teach. Many of us are in situations where we're communicating with the media and other folks, and so having these skills where we're practicing it time and time again is so helpful in building that willingness to fail, because we're going to need a little bit of that to address our challenges. Laverne Seifert, who's in the audience today, is one of our wonderful improv actors who's guided this experience and actually founded the Improv for Scientists course that's available on campus. So that is something that's also available in addition to the workshop series. So we'll play this short video, and then we'll do a little bit of improv.
And I'm going to ask for some brave souls to come forward. And so the scientist community, they need to really understand that most people have no idea what they're doing. And it is so important. Obviously, the research is changing our world. And so Speaking Science is a class or a workshop that allows participants, scientists, research students to come in and better practice their communication skills.
At least for me, one of the really big problems that we have as scientists is that we don't really communicate our science to the general population. That's why they don't think that it's important. And I saw this program and I was like, this is perfect, because I'm trying to perfect my scientific communication skills and I didn't know where to start, and this just came out of nowhere, and I was like, well, this is where I'm gonna begin, and it was great.
The idea came from the Improv for Scientists class, and I took that class last semester, and it just completely opened my eyes as to the genius of merging theater and science. So with that, we decided to implement it within Boreas, and here we are.
And go!
I knew the sessions were working even before we started because we had such a huge outpouring of interest. We had 90 people interested in the first session before we even started. And then when we got into the room and you saw people loosening up and getting more comfortable, people went from being very standoffish, kind of closed off, to just feeling alive and empowered and excited to communicate their research.
I've done years and years of mindfulness or meditation, but in that 1 hour and a half section, I was much more able to be present in the moment than I have been through these other trainings that I've tried.
We have one exercise where we dramatize our research. We add an element of theater to exactly what we're researching. So for me, what I study is fire. I was able to basically bring people inside of a forest, at least in their minds, and describe to them how fires or winds or different disturbances might be affecting the forests of now and the future.
Because I'm not a native English speaker, before I was always afraid that I was gonna get stuck in a word or something, but now everything flows better.
Notice the second time around you had a wider eye contact.
One of the things that I think we really face, not only in academia, but in society as a whole, is a disconnection and a lack of connection with one another. And so being able to have this vehicle to more deeply connect with one another, but also to communicate our research at the same time, I think is one of the ways that we can really move forward and progress on the difficult challenges we face, and to get the public, policymakers, and others on board with what we have to share.
All right, great, fantastic, yeah, excellent job, yeah, right?
All right, so now it is my pleasure to introduce Sam Reed. Sam is the co-chair of the Boreas leadership team who came up with the idea of making this a series. And one of the greatest pleasures of my professional life has been working with Sam, because he's just so dedicated and committed to making science communication a priority at the University of Minnesota. And he's going to share with us an exercise to get us to connect with one another.
Hi, everyone. My name's Sam. It's a little bright. I'm a second-year PhD student in Natural Resources Science and Management. And as you already saw from the video, I study fires and all types of disturbances in forests. And as much as I would love to talk about myself all day, I have like 5 minutes. So I'm going to be the guy who encourages you all to stand up relatively quickly as well. And we're just going to do a little bit of improv right now. So you have let's say like 2.5 seconds to think of your 4-sentence research pitch. 4 sentences, we don't have any time for any more. Turn to your neighbor, give it. And then after that, maybe like 30, 35 seconds, the person next to you will give their research pitch. Go ahead. Don't dilly-dally in how long it takes to decide. Bear calls, that's kind of fun. Does it count? What?
Something harder than this.
I don't have time. I would love to. This is just a little teaser. I should have timed them, how long I was giving them. Oh well. Yeah. Oh well. I'll give them a little bit. What? Oh. Going okay? All right, so if you haven't switched yet, please switch. If you have not switched yet, please switch. And if you have switched, just look at me with dead eyes. 1 minute, all right. All right, you're done. We have 1 minute. Sorry, if I could have your guys' attention again, I apologize. This went faster than I expected. Okay, so I have 1 minute. Were you guys breathing when you did this? Let's just think about that for a second. Were you breathing while you did this? Were your shoulders tense? I mean, like really breathing, like through your stomach. Like, was there enough oxygen going to your head? Were your shoulders a little tense, maybe? Maybe a little bit, like, stressed? All right, so that's totally normal. We've all been there. And really, I guess the whole big spiel is kind of taking all of the things you're learning today, all of the things that you need to improve on in terms of communicating science. We provide a community for you to do that. We provide you a place that is completely judgment-free to kind of act out, but still talking about your science in a absolutely fantastic way with absolutely fantastic people. So I highly encourage that you guys come out to Speaking Science Improv and absolutely have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you all. I'm here till 2022.
Thank you, Sam. You can see why I like him so much. So we're going to take a break until 10:40, so be back here at 10:40. And please enjoy the food. One thing